Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching The Salty Sea, and today I'm going to try to put down a definitive video on how to build a powerful Warcry list. Hopefully, this doesn't get invalidated when all the rules change this summer. But I think that there's a lot to kind of that's floating out there that needs to be codified in just one place. Before I start, though, I've put a little sign here saying your logo here. It's kind of shocking to me that I haven't already done this, but I'm interested in talking with anyone who might be a watcher of the channel who's got some sort of professional illustrator skills, or if you know anybody. Otherwise I'll just be going to Fiverr to do it, but it's probably time to build a logo for myself, or maybe have sort of my own way to write the word Warcry so that I'm not just using the official GW version, stuff like that. So, let me know. Let me know if you've got any leads on someone who would be good to work with. So let's talk about first just the parameters I'm going to talk about for how to build a solid list. There's a lot here that I didn't invent. If you kind of go through a lot of Rito's videos, if you don't know who that is, that was really the first big content creator for Warcry, well before I got started. In fact, it was Rito sort of saying he liked my channel that sort of actually for the first time brought people to see what I was doing. So I just owe a lot to him. He sort of lost interest in Warcry for Malifaux, but before doing so, put down a lot of really good information that's there for you to peruse. Even though sort of the TOC and sort of recent developments have changed a lot of the specifics, a lot of the generalities that he's talked about are still there. You can also see a lot of this in the Warcry Discord, but I want to put it all in one place now. I'm going to assume for this video a fairly even mix of the base game, Red Harvest, and the Tome of Champions missions, and I'll just kind of add in some addendums for Warcry, or sorry, for Catacombs as well, even though I won't sort of count them in most of the numbers. As far as sort of how to build a list, I think that there's four primary concerns that you need to be building around. One of them being sort of the basic game mechanics, one of them being the missions and victory conditions, then there's the strengths of your faction, and just the factor of enjoying your toys. Because at the end of the day, this is a game that's supposed to be fun. So before I get into that, though, I want to talk about something that seems to be an issue with almost every sort of collectible strategy game, and that's to netlist or not. So there's a lot of emotion tacked onto the concept of netlisting, less now than there used to be, so that's a bit of a relief. But I want to talk about where do netlists come from, because it's not like there is some all-knowing hive mind that creates these net lists. They come from actual people. Now, sure, in a bigger community with lots of people, the chances that someone has come up with a really amazing list is sort of a lot higher than it is. So, for Warcry, there's sort of limited resources. I hear a lot of people say that they've taken lists from things that I've highlighted in my videos. I think that's great. Another source that'll become more and more possible is tournaments. For example, this Slaves to Darkness list just won a small tournament in New Zealand. I think this is a great thing to go off of, especially finding things that don't come straight from me. Right? It's important to kind of vary where you find your net lists. But I want to talk about net listing, hopefully from a disengaged from emotion standpoint, and just talking about what's actually going on underneath the hood there. So Richard Garfield actually just wrote a really interesting theoretical article on sort of players in general. He was talking about tournaments versus ladders and what strategy games should sort of lean towards. But in the middle of that article, he talked about different types of players and how they put their lists together. Now, he was talking about card games, not just Magic, but also Hearthstone, etc. But it can really be a part of any kind of game like this where you're sort of putting lists ahead of time and then you're playing them where play skill matters, but also list building matters. And he split players into innovators versus honers. Now, an innovator being someone who wants to sort of come up with brand new strategies that sort of challenge the existing understanding of how things work. And a honer being someone who wants to hone and perfect the existing powerful strategies that are out there that are well known. If you netlist something but you don't do any honing, you're going to have pretty medium results. Now, you're not going to have total failures because this is at least a list that's proven to be successful in someone else's hands. It's not going to be a pile of garbage. But if you netlist something without sort of honing it, without sort of testing it, figuring out how to play it, you're just not going to have the excellent results that it posted on said tournament. Because honing is a big part of actually making these work, right? Like actually playing them, testing them, figuring out what makes said net list tick is really important to having any kind of tournament success. And then you also have to think about there are rewards for innovation, and a careful thinker can produce something that's able to attack a given sort of metagame or a given understanding about how the game works. But to do that, you need to understand why the net lists that are out there, why they exist and why they're doing what they're doing, because you need to take a look at what's out there and then think about how to attack that sort of metagame. If you brew just kind of randomly without understanding what's out there and why what's out there is doing what it's doing, that's going to end in heartbreak for you. So I guess what I want to just highlight is the fact that innovating is very possible no matter how big the pool of hive mind people are out there sort of that you're innovating against, because there's always just specific lists that are out there to attack that you can, try to find the tools to attack. And at the same time, net listing on its own is not always going to be the answer. So, one example of this, for example, and why you should kind of look at different sort of sources for these sorts of lists is, I worked with Lila on sort of creating a really interesting Slanesh Demons list, sort of post-TOC nerfs to the Epitome, where, we settled on the Epitome, a Blissbringer, a Fiend, and 5 Demonettes. But someone also just, that same tournament where someone won with Slaves to Darkness, the person who took second did it with an Infernal Enraptress, a Lord of Pain as an ally, and 8 Demonettes. Now, if you were playing in a no allies tournament, the Lord of Pain could be one of several heroes, because this list has plenty of points left over, because the person, Weird O on Instagram, you can check them out. They also won Best Painted in the tournament. This person put their list together before the points updates, and so now there's room in the list because, the Infernal Enraptress and the Lord of Pain have both dropped a bit. But the point here is to say that there's more out here than what I've featured on the channel, and that this list is well put together in a way that's, innovative if you hadn't thought of it before, right? We mentioned the possibility of this list in our video, but I think we probably undersold the power of it. I actually ended up testing this, and I think one thing that I really undersold was how the Infernal Enraptress, her shooting attack does about the same amount of damage on average that, say, your average unplayable mage does with their shooting attack. But what makes the Infernal Enraptress one so much better is because there's more attacks that do less damage, it's just way less likely to whiff, which means it's much better at cleaning up either really tiny things like giant rats or cleaning up sort of models that have been left on just a couple wounds, right? Your chances of doing that with an Infernal Enraptress are just much, much higher. So it's about the same average damage, but just a much, much higher floor, which I think makes it a much better unit. So just something to think about as I get into kind of the base structures of how you actually build a powerful list. And the first thing is to just be aware of how the game works, right? So there's a few things going on with Warcry kind of under the hood. The first is quote unquote Warcry's activation wars. Now in AOS, this is more about who goes first. In Warcry, it's about who gets to control who goes how many times, basically. More game actions is almost always going to be better in this game because each fighter has two activations that they can do. And the wait mechanic, for example, lets you kind of force timing on sort of what goes when. There's a lot of times when, say, you might have a really heavy hitter with the ability to charge onto an objective and deal a bunch of damage there. But if your opponent can use weights to not actually move their models onto the objective until your big heavy hitter has been forced to go, then you end up wasting a ton of your damage, for example. And then they can all just move on to the objective after you've been forced to move there, and they get to kind of get out of your way and not actually get all that damage dealt to them. So there's just a lot of utility behind having more activations at your command, which is why just having lots of fighters in your warband is just always going to be a useful thing in Warcry. The second major mechanic of the game is the dice mechanic. Now, there's sort of a few different types of dice abilities. There's sort of force multipliers like Onslaught, Rampage. I should have put Rush here because Rush adding to movement matters more for a high impact fighter the same way Onslaught giving more attacks or Rampage giving more activations to a fighter. Because Rush delivers, for a big chunky fighter, Rush delivers more power to an area if you're using it on a big elite fighter than it does if you're using it on a small fighter. The other types of abilities are disruption abilities, things that mess with your opponent. Now, those are going to be based more on your opponent's warband than your own, so there's less you can control there. But with all of the force multiplier abilities, they kind of favor really high impact fighters. Finally, there's the deployment mechanic, which is just the fact that your Warcry warband is always going to be split into 3 different teams. And sort of in the base game, the vast majority of the time, the shield would always be on in round 1. That's been less true recently. In Catacombs, Red Harvest, and the Tome of Champions, there's a balanced split between the deployment groups. Now, that's going to really change how you build a warband, right? Because when the shield is almost always on, you can really heavily weight things towards your shield. But in a more balanced game, you have to think a little bit harder about that. Also, sort of, this is a little bit true in the base game, but it's more true now. There's almost always going to be 2 deployment groups on the field at any one time, and 1 that's not, which I think really changes things because you can get away with having only 2 threats and knowing that at the very least one of them is going to be on the battlefield to start things off. So just to kind of summarize the implications of these game mechanics, you want to play a lot of chaff models to boost your activations. You want at least 1 elite power piece to sort of force multiply with your dice to get the most value out of the dice mechanic. And then to play with deployment, you have a strong incentive to have at least 2 threats, and some very small incentive to have a 3rd. You also have an incentive to have power projection in all 3 zones because oftentimes the group that comes in last is going to be coming in outside of the fight, and a lot of games are won by the warband whose trailing deployment group is able to affect the fight when the other warband wasn't. So there is some incentive to have power projection to kind of avoid those auto loss scenarios in all 3 of your deployment zones. The one time you can kind of ignore this is if your list is kind of a main combo in one deployment group plus a plan B. That's something that, you know, can work for certain warbands based on the deployment mechanic. So then to move from sort of the base game mechanics to the victory conditions, the actual ways you win, I'm going to focus, by the way, on the matched play ones, just because the sort of purposefully unbalanced ones, it's very hard to build your warband to take those into account because they're purposefully skewing the game to try to make it almost unwinnable for one warband and very easy for another warband with the purposes of, that mixing things up. So let's start by actually talking about what's in these victory conditions. So the base game, it's got 3 treasure missions, 5 objective control missions, and 6 hunter missions, and 4 area control missions. I'll talk more about what that means later. But I just want to show the spread, right? Red Harvest, it's got 1 treasure, 3 objective, 1 hunter, 1 area control. And the TOC has 2 treasure missions, 2 objective missions, 1 hunter, and 1 area control. So 20% of the missions in the game are treasure missions. These are ones where treasure are little pieces of literally treasure that your fighters get to carry around. And basically, the various victories, they go based on who's carrying the most treasure. You get to score points for carrying it, or it matters who's got the treasure at the end. The important thing about these missions is that big flyers going first win every single time. Now that's just, unfortunately, it's just a blanket statement that those are true. Now, there is sort of the one mission that says treasure, search for Varanite in Red Harvest. It says treasure, but it doesn't play as treasure because that's the one where big flyers don't auto win it. But for the most part, if you're going first and you have a 10-inch flyer with a significant amount of wounds, you get to go take the treasure, run away, and no one can catch you. So going first is extremely important. But in the case of a situation where the team without a flyer goes first, flyers are also just really good at chasing down treasure holders. Now, there is a little bit of counterplay to this. For example, nets can help. Artillery pieces that can shoot the flyer from far away because no one's going to catch that flyer. So artillery pieces can be really important to just try their best to shoot the flyer out of the sky. Speed for warbands that can't field flyers, speed is very important. So, anything that moves 8 and is allowed to hold a treasure is going to be useful even if it doesn't fly, stuff like that. And then something that can be useful is things like the Skyfire Aviarch, which is the leader of a Skyfire unit, or the Knight Venator, which can be a flyer for when you go first, you just take the treasure and win, or when you go second, these can be artillery pieces so that you can just try to shoot down your opponent's treasure holder. Just to note here, the counterplay of using artillery to shoot down flyers, it is a real long shot. It's a Hail Mary. It usually won't work, but it's your best bet, right? This is going from auto loss because you went second to, having a 10% chance to win, which if there's a tournament with a bunch of treasure missions, chase the value if you can. I would really sort of suggest to TOs that they don't include many treasure missions in their packs. And if they do, maybe they sort of create twists where treasures, for example, I have a podcast, by the way, with the awesome dudes at Tabletop and Beyond. We're just doing once a month. The latest one is probably out there, but they have a really good house rule where treasures are heavy and you lose flying if you pick them up. That can be something that's really useful. But generally, I would say if you're a TO who wants to only go by sort of Warcry specific, sort of created by GW rules, I would just avoid treasure missions altogether. Now, 1/3 of the missions in the various packs I showed before are objective missions. What matters most in objective missions is numbers. Having lots and lots of numbers in your warband. Because sort of players have to focus on getting to the objective first, right? So you can score on the objective without engaging, without having to fight. And so also, most of them let you place at least one of the objectives. So speed is going to matter a lot less for most of your numbers. So you don't have to worry that much if your chaff is very fast for these objective missions, because it's actually pretty possible to get to them. At least sort of the neutral objective and your home objective are going to be easier to get to regardless. So the one thing is there are a few where it places the objectives for you, but it tends to place the objectives in pretty central locations that most warbands can get to. Now the counterplay to having sort of to fighting warbands with tons of numbers is efficiently one-shotting chaff models. So I think that, any kind of artillery piece again that can just shoot chaff off the board, or any kind of sort of somewhat fast moving but high damage unit that can in melee sort of go to an objective and then in round 2 take 2 chaff units off, and then in round 3 take 2 more chaff units off. Those are very good because they fight against your opponent's number advantage without sacrificing activation efficiency, right? If you can take out an opponent while only using one activation, that's very good. Occasionally, also, AoE buffs are also going to be very good. Abilities that say add 1 attack to every friendly fighter within a certain amount of area. Those can also be very good because sometimes these objective missions devolve around a team fight around one objective where, say, or 2 objectives where, say, there's 4 objectives on the board, 2 of them are safe and 2 of them are being contested. Sort of being able to buff all your fighters around one of those objectives can be very powerful. 27% of the missions in the game are what I call hunter missions. Now, these are things where you need to kill a specific model of your opponents or a specific deployment group of your opponents. They need to kill the same thing of yours. The thing that matters here most is power projection. And this is the one type of mission, unfortunately there's only one, but this is the one where durability matters as well. So you really want flexibility here because you can't control where you will be hunted or what you have to hunt. So you really need to be able to be flexible with what your warband is capable of. Artillery is important here, and dragons are important. Dragons being fast things that also deal legitimate damage, can win a lot of fights. Fast chaff, too, is very important because it's equally good at running away, because that's very important if you're the target, or catching a unit that is running away and then bogging them down by just tying them in place where they have to use disengage actions to get out of there instead of using full movement. So fast chaff is extremely good in these hunter missions, as is anything that can sort of cover a ton of the board and then do damage. So artillery and dragons can both do that. By artillery, I mean things like lead belchers, sort of single pieces that do a lot of damage at range. I find those a lot more powerful than gun lines in these types of missions, just because gun lines can be weakened by just dealing with a few of them as if they're chaff, or they can be sort of moved out of the way of because they take a long time to do their damage. They take the entire round to do their damage, whereas an artillery piece can do it all at once. The counterplay for sort of that sort of power projection really mostly is joining them. But things like nets can be very powerful in these missions, and so can bubble wraps. So if you have slow chaff, that can be really weak in these hunter missions. The one place where it can be useful is the hunter missions like Blood Marked or Cut Off the Head, where you're not killing a deployment group, but you're killing one specific model. You can use your slow chaff to bubble wrap the important model, and that can be very powerful specifically in those few hunter missions. A lot of hunter missions, you can't use your chaff that way. Well, you can, but it's just not that effective. And so it really depends specifically on the mission. Now, another 20% of missions are what I would call area control missions. These are a lot like objective missions, but they don't revolve around an objective. They usually revolve around areas, like, say, one end of the board or four corners of the board, something like that. So the players have a lot less control over where they're going to fight because the areas are so big, but they have a lot more control over how to fight, right? Because you get to sort of, an objective pins you in this 3-inch bubble right around the objective, whereas the sort of bigger areas, they're just a lot bigger area to pick your fights in, which means that sort of flexibility and the ability to sort of project power matters just as much as numbers do, right? In an objective mission, the most important thing is just numbers and getting onto the objective. But here, it's important to actually have some mobility and flexibility over how you're going to engage, because if you don't, your opponent gets to kind of set the rules of engagement, and that's going to be bad for you in a way that's, you don't get punished for lacking it in a regular objective mission. Gun lines, also, this is the one place where gun lines are quite good because you both count for numbers, and a lot of these, say, the platforms one, for example, you want to stand on one platform and put damage onto the other. So, but you also want to count for numbers on each platform. So there's a lot of these too where you need to stand in one corner of the board and have numbers there, but deal damage to another corner of the board. So this is the one type of mission where I think that gun lines are very, very good. The counterplay to the sort of level 1 things that are good is movement abilities. So anything that can sort of boost up the movement of a set of fighters in a set of area, that can kind of change the game as far as where they get to engage. Anything like that is going to be really good, and can make warbands that are otherwise slow sort of be threats in these area control missions, essentially without necessarily paying as many points for their movement. So kind of the summary here, you're looking for kind of level 1 is 10-inch flyers, fighty chaff, you know, these artillery, dragons, and fast chaff are most important. Again, talking about fighty chaff versus fast chaff can be different because, you know, something like a plague bearer hits way above its weight in terms of actual fights that it gets in, so it can be truly incredible in objective missions, but won't achieve necessarily all of that utility in hunter missions without something to boost its movement, right? Without a sloppity bile piper nearby, for example. And then I also have kind of some of the counterplay that's available to you that isn't necessarily going to be good in a vacuum on these types of missions, but it will be very good countering what else is good. So, you know, these one-hit KO fighters, for example, they're not actually very good in objective missions, right? But they are very good against the things that are good in objective missions. But if your opponent has a warband that isn't full of lots of chaff units, then all of a sudden your fighter that's designed to one-hit KO chaff units, it's going to all of a sudden be lacking stuff to one-hit KO, and it won't actually be clearing off these objectives as efficiently. Now, that person who hasn't brought a lot of chaff is going to be in a lot of trouble against someone who has brought chaff, right? So there's a little bit of a rock, paper, scissors there going on, but hey, that's the essence of these strategy games. But I did just want to talk about, you know, to put up on screen here what's good in a vacuum, what the best thing against a wide variety of stuff is, and then some things that work very well specifically against it. By the way, under area control, when I say counterplay of Savage Arrow Boss or Abhorrent Archregent, Savage Arrow Boss is just the cheapest way to get a Wa into your list as an ally. The Abhorrent Archregent is, or maybe it's the Abhorrent Archking, is a really cheap way to get a very fast movement ability in the Death Grand Alliance, for example. Now, I also wanted to really quick talk about hidden agendas and secondary points. These won't matter for most people most of the time. If a tournament's giving prizes for second place and it's got between 9 and 16 people, then hidden agendas and secondary points will matter. If it's got more than 17 players and it's a one-day tournament, hidden agendas and secondary points will matter. But playing with your buddies, if you just want to win a game, they're not going to matter. Any 16-player one-day tournament where the prizes for, say, best painted, best general, and best sports, these won't matter in that case. So it's very corner cases, so I don't want to spend much time on it. Just secondary points essentially just reward players who, when winning, they play very carefully. When losing, they play extremely aggressive. There's a very slight reward there for durable leaders, but for the most part, they don't affect list building much. Hidden agendas, they reward warbands that don't need abilities to function, because there's a lot of hidden agendas where you win it if you basically give up dice value during your game. So warbands like Tzeentch Arcanites that don't necessarily care that much about the dice, those can be good there, especially also because they have a durable leader. There's big rewards here for having sort of something in your warband with a lot of wounds that can take a real punch, and there's another hidden agenda that rewards you if that thing is your leader. It also rewards having fast, killy chaff, so things that there's a bunch of these hidden agendas that sort of reward you for being in certain parts of the board at the end of the game, that having lots of fighters that can just run and go do it is very useful. There's also something where you win it if you kill something big with a small fighter, and there's a lot of sort of cheap chaff in the game that can achieve that, right? Stuff like Demonettes can really achieve that, or Plague Monks can really achieve that, stuff like that. So those are just the rewards for the hidden agendas, but it won't matter for most players. The next thing is, it's important to play to your faction's strengths once you've picked a faction, right? So one way to do that is abilities, right? Look for combos that let you kind of bypass the limitations of your fighters. Some examples of abilities here are Wog, Crack the Whip, and Sharp-Eyed Scryhawk. That's for Orc War Clans, Skaven, and Lumineth Realm Lords, respectively. Those are all abilities that let you achieve things that your warband wouldn't necessarily be able to do otherwise, that can be important ways to maximize what your faction is capable of, and things to therefore build around. The other thing is, look at your top fighters and tailor your warband to maybe skew that direction. So if one of your fighters does its job better than any other fighter does theirs, it can be worth leaning that way. So for example, Khorne Demons, Gorehounds, it's actually very hard to kind of make the math work in a clean way to fit 2 Gorehounds into your list. You give up a lot in terms of losing the number of bloodletters. Gorehounds aren't leaders, so you give up on having, basically you can either have 2 Gorehounds and have a reasonable number of fighters in your list, or you can have 2 Gorehounds and also have a durable, strong leader, which we've covered is important for a lot of things with list building. Normally you would just say, well, why do we have 2 Gorehounds then? Let's only run 1. But Gorehound is so much more powerful than everything else that faction is doing that you really want to run 2 of them. You really want to be maximizing what Khorne Demons can do with that one fighter that's so much more powerful than everything else, right? There's another example with Bone Splitters. Savage Orcs are much more chaff-like than Moorboys are, right? They cost 20 points less. They fulfill a lot of these sort of victory conditions a little bit sort of on paper. They would fulfill them better. The thing is, though, Moorboys point for point are just so much more powerful in terms of damage output that I would suggest most Bone Splitters players lean on Moorboys over Savage Orcs, just because they're so much more powerful. So there's just things to think about where your warband it won't necessarily behoove you to just mindlessly play towards the victory conditions if you've got one fighter that just does its job better than anything else in your faction. Um, it's also worth looking at if you've got trends among the fighters in your faction, right? If a lot of the fighters in your faction do their job in a similar way that another fighter does their job, right? So the classic example here would be Slaanesh Demons, where you've just got multiple disruption abilities all across the range. Everything that's not a demonette is trying to put your opponent off balance, which I think should be a real sort of signpost for you that you should be trying, and especially in terms of how you play this faction, you should be trying to, yes, do a ton of damage with demonettes, but you should be leaning control with everything that's not a demonette, and you should probably have multiple control elements in your list. For example, that New Zealand Slaanesh list that I talked about, they've got sort of multiple board control sort of AoEs going on. And then that's sort of buffing the demonettes by either keeping them alive or pumping up their damage, right? Which is sort of a very sort of specific way to do it, and it's using multiple fighters doing that job in the same way, right? The Lord of Pain and the Infernal Enrapturous are both leaning towards area control there. So sort of leaning into those trends can, I think, really help out a list. The last thing is enjoying your toys, right? Because most people watching this, I totally get it. They're not here trying to win a specific tournament. They're just trying to play a fun faction, a fun sort of set of models in a way that's going to be sort of very functional, highly functional on the tabletop, right? So you can play to sort of test the very limits of the game, find the most powerful possible list that you can. Or you can just be trying to explore the game's depth in a way that's still sort of at a power level that you find acceptable, right? So I find that a lot of the time on sort of a lot of, not just with Warcry, but a lot of casual strategy games is when someone says that their list is casual, a lot of people don't quite know how to respond to it, because play what you like doesn't necessarily mean play whatever, right? There's a lot of people who, yes, they don't want to play the most powerful thing, but they do want advice on their lists of how to make their list sort of more powerful, given that they want to play with, say, a couple not very strong fighters that they do like, right? So it's possible to kind of take the principles that I've talked about before and optimize for fun, and sort of optimize around a piece that's fun. So when I talk about how that's often how innovation happens here, what I mean is if you take a piece you really like and then you go, okay, this piece might not be the most powerful thing in the game, but what is the most effective way to maximize it? A lot of the time that can be actually how list innovation happens, because you might find that once you've actually maximized around this piece, you have something that's actually very powerful and able to kind of go toe-to-toe with the meta. So I wanted to do an example of this where I don't know if the list involved is actually going to be a sort of powerful meta list, but I wanted to sort of talk process, right, so you could see. So I wanted to do the example of a slaughter priest, and for some reason I haven't put a picture of a slaughter priest on this slide, but bear with me, right? So the slaughter priest is a really interesting piece. It's there's two different slaughter priests. One of them, in my opinion, is a really incredible model. The one with the two different weapons. And so for a lot of people, right, the list that they want to run is going to have their favorite model to paint on it. And so I think the slaughter priest is an incredible model. It's also got a really interesting ability. It's got a pull ability. So it's called Bloodbind. You force your opponent to make a move action towards you. And so that can be really fun. A lot of people really swear by these types of abilities. I don't know if the Slaughter Priest itself is the most competitive model because its combat stats are not sort of near the top, but this ability can be very effective, and I think it's worth trying to build around, right? So let's kind of try that here. So the one thing to really note is it gives your opponent a moment to counter activate. So you run this, now your slaughter priest can't then do inspiring presence to let you activate right away with something else. So your opponent gets an activation to respond. So the activation wars here are very important for you, which means you're going to want to run a lot of Blood Reavers because that is Khorne Bloodbound's way to win the activation wars. That's their cheapest fighter. So you're going to want to start your list with a lot of Blood Reavers. Second, we've already talked about there's a lot of reasons to have another threat in another deployment group, right? Because one, the Slaughter Priest, it does respectable damage. It is a threat, but it's not the scariest threat, especially for its points. So let's look at what Khorne Bloodbound has available to them, right? They've got the Wrathmaster, they've got Exalted Deathbringers, and they've got Korgoraths. Those are all very respectable threats to put in another deployment group if you're running a Slaughter Priest. Finally, we've got some incentive to have another fairly high damage fighter in the Slaughter Priest deployment because we're pulling something towards us with the Slaughter Priest, right? And then, yes, that's amazing if we're in an area control mission or a treasure mission, or sorry, area control or objective mission where we're sort of pulling it off of an objective or out of an important area, right? Then the pullability is good on its own. But if we're in a treasure mission or a hunter mission where this is a target that we want to pull towards us and then we want to kill it, there we have some real incentive to have another high damage piece, but we don't want to really sacrifice the activation wars to do it, right? So Sayic out of Garruk's Reavers, that's the Garruk's Reaver that deals a lot of damage, is a really great piece here to go with the Slaughter Priest because Sayic deals a ton of damage, but it's pretty cheap. Now, the reason Sayic is cheap is because Sayic's so fragile for how many points he costs, but the Slaughter Priest, I think, really helps cover Sayic's weaknesses, which is getting into position and attacking, right? Because the Slaughter Priest can just bring something for Sayic to hopefully maybe do a double attack on, but if not, then to charge and attack. Because the one thing you can never do with Sayic is double move him into position, hoping to fight next round, because your opponent will just prioritize him and take him out. So the Slaughter Priest really covers his weaknesses, and he covers the Slaughter Priest's sort of need to have another threat going on in his deployment group. So here's an example Bloodbind combo list, right? You put your shield, and this is where you're specifically having your Bloodbind combo with your Slaughter Priest, your Sayic, and a Blood Reaver. And then in your dagger, you can have another threat. So here I've chosen the cheapest threat because I'm worried about the activation wars. So here the cheapest really good threat for Khorne is going to be the Exalted Deathbringer with the Great Axe. If you prefer the spear is just as good, costs just as many points. Just depends whether you want the range 2 or the little bit extra damage. And then I put 2 Blood Reavers to go with it to either body block for it or just get on objectives. I really value having at least one of these fast Blood Reavers in every deployment group. And then the hammer is just going to be 4 Blood Reavers. Is this the most competitive way to run Khorne? Probably not, right? I still really rate the Wrathmaster as sort of the most points efficient damage piece in the warband. But, you know, one, this is Warcry. There's no harm in being a little suboptimal. And two, this is a list that is very well sort of put together, tuned, that it may well be just as powerful as a Wrathmaster list because this list has a real plan to it, right? You've got a specific combo that you really care about that when you pull it off is really powerful and can single-handedly win certain missions. It is also just got a really important threat in it that isn't just your combo, right? So it's got a legitimate plan B aside from the combo. Um, so, you know, the difference between a min-maxed, an absolute most powerful list in a faction, and a slightly suboptimal but very well-tuned list, that that difference is very small compared to the difference between a tuned but suboptimal list versus a casual list, right? One that hasn't put a ton of thought into where things go in different deployment groups, stuff like that. So I do think a list like this, you could bring it to a tournament. Maybe you are giving up a little bit of value, but this is a very powerful list. And so I hope that kind of showing the thought process around how to make something would do that. And you can do this around any kind of favorite model that you have. The other thing you can do is you can sort of depower this list for sort of more casual play or for narrative play, right? So an example of how to do that. You could say make Sayic into a Skull Taker. Now, Skull Takers do just the tiniest bit less damage for Sayic, but they're significantly more durable. They also have their own ability that can be useful if you don't want to do the combo. And it's just because they're safer and more durable, it's easier to pull off the combo with the Slaughter Priest. There's just a lower ceiling of efficiency there. The other thing you could do is you could switch the Exalted Deathbringer for a Korgorath. This gives you a lot more power, right? Korgoraths are much more powerful. The thing is that point for point, Korgoraths aren't as threatening, pound for pound as the Exalted Deathbringers are. Korgoraths took some pretty big points hits in the TOC, right? So just they're much less efficient than the Deathbringer. Now, then you would sort of drop 7 Blood Reavers down to 5 to make room for the bigger bodies. This would sort of certainly weaken your combo as far as the activation wars is concerned, but you'd still have a chance to pull it off, and it would really mostly weaken your combo against against more savvy opponents who are sort of maximizing their activations. It'll matter a lot less in sort of a casual game, right? So you've sort of decreased your utility, you've decreased your ceiling in a lot of missions, but this is a list that if you made these changes, it would be much easier to pilot, right? For sort of, if you are sort of putting a few drinks back with the buddies, this will be a much easier list to play. And it'll also probably be easier to play against, right? Because, there's fewer activations happening here, so your opponent won't have to wait things out as much. So it'll just be sort of less stress for all involved, essentially. So I do think that sort of making these changes, if you're in sort of a more fun environment, can absolutely sort of make this exact same concept for a list work, but at just a different power level, which I think is very valuable. So let's take this information and go back to the net lists, right? So that tournament winning list that with the Exalted Champion, the Slaves to Darkness list using the Blissful One ally, we see now, right, this has a lot of cheap fighty chaff, which we talked about as being important in so many missions. It's got 2 very fast fighters, and 2 really major threats, right? The Exalted Champion does a ton of damage and is very hard to kill. The Blissful One, easy to kill, but does a ton of damage, very threatening. And then the Marauder Horseman is very fast. So every deployment zone can either have something mobile or something scary, or in one case, something that's both. And then there's just a ton of activations here, right? It's 10 fighters. So we can see kind of the nuts and bolts about why this list is so powerful and why it was able to win that tournament. I also want to talk about what I consider currently the boogeyman of competitive Warcry, which is if you were to put a list together that's 2 Broodmasters, 3 Doomweavers with nets, and 9 Spiders. This is a 14 fighter list, so going right up against that 15 maximum. Spiders are both chaff and a threat because they do so much damage, and a proxy for 10-inch flyers because they all move 8. So they literally just do it all with one unit. It's actually kind of absurd. Then this list also has nets in every deployment zone for disruption, for counterplay against other people's powerful things. Then finally, the Broodmaster has abilities that provide durability and extra damage that you wouldn't normally have access to, especially with durability, right? So you just have a ton of ability utility as well here. Um, so sort of to go back into innovating versus honing, right? Let's talk about kind of the building blocks of what sort of makes these powerful, right, is right there. So now you have a chance. I'm not going to do it on this show because if I did, I would say something else is the boogeyman, right? But now you have a chance. You understand what makes these lists so powerful, and now you can try to design something to try to counter them. Um, or if you sort of decide that you don't know how to counter them or you don't want to try to figure it out, um, you can sort of take these. Now you know what makes them powerful, and so now you have a starting point for sort of how to hone them if you want to make changes, right? If you think I've missed something with this boogeyman tarantulas list and you think you can improve it, now you can actually sort of test out and improve on your own. So hopefully this has been helpful to folks. Um, Adepticon is just a week away. Um, so, you know, hopefully you can sort of take this and sort of do the last adjustments on whatever list you're planning to take to that tournament if you're going. But otherwise, this can be useful both as a way to build more powerful lists in your play group, but also like I showed before with the Slaughter Priest list, you can use the tools of knowing what's powerful to also make something less powerful if you've been sort of stomping your opponents and sort of you want to be able to give them a chance while still achieving the goals and the fun goals that that you set up for your warband. So this will likely be the last video I make before Adepticon. I'm going to kind of focus more on painting because I still have some stuff to paint before then. Might be able to just do like a showcase potentially before the tournament of sort of deciding what to bring, but probably not. But what I will do is a whole bunch of Adepticon review stuff. I'm hoping to do interviews with some of the people there. I'm hoping to kind of talk about results a little bit. Yeah, so looking to sort of put a lot of stuff out there in about like 2 weeks time after the tournaments happen. So until then, especially if you're going to be playing between now and then, may all your rolls be crits.